The old pickup truck coughed and wheezed as it rolled into the dusty border town just as the sun was setting. Behind the wheel sat a man whose eyes held more pain than most people see in a lifetime. His name was David, and 3 months ago, his world had fallen apart completely. David's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as memories flooded back. The hospital bills were still scattered across his kitchen table back home. $23,000 for treatments that didn't work. Insurance that covered almost nothing. A wife who died anyway, whispering apologies for being such a burden. The house was gone now, sold to pay what he could. The rest of the debt would follow him forever. He pulled into a gas station at the edge of town. The attendant, a weathered, old man with kind eyes, came over to fill the tank. "You okay, son?" the man asked, noticing David's hollow stare. "You look like you've been driving for days." "Something like that," David replied, his voice rough from not speaking to anyone for hours. The truth was, he had been driving for days, ever since he'd made the decision that brought him here, ever since he'd decided that some people needed to pay for what happened to his wife. The town of San Esperanza wasn't much to look at. Cracked sidewalks, faded storefronts, and the kind of quiet that comes when hope has packed up and moved somewhere else. But David wasn't here for the scenery. He was here because someone had told him that in places like this, a man could buy things that weren't sold in regular stores. As he drove down the main street, David saw the faces of people who understood struggle. A mother carrying groceries, in torn plastic bags, walking because she couldn't afford gas. An old man sitting on a porch that looked ready to collapse, watching the world go by with tired eyes. Kids playing in a vacant lot because there was no playground in their neighborhood. 3 months ago, David would have felt sorry for these people. Now, he felt a strange kinship with them. They were all survivors of a system that didn't care about regular folks. The difference was, David had reached his breaking point. He parked near the old market district, where his contact had said he'd find what he was looking for. The buildings here were older, some abandoned, others barely hanging on as small businesses. A barber shop with a broken sign, a convenience store with bars on the windows, a restaurant that served the kind of food that filled your stomach without emptying your wallet. David walked slowly down the street, feeling like a stranger in his own skin. 6 months ago, he was a different person. He coached Little League, on weekends helped his neighbors fix their cars, and believed that good things happened to good people. Now he knew better. The weight of what he planned to do pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy coat. His wife would have been horrified. She always believed in forgiveness, in turning the other cheek, in finding peaceful solutions. But she wasn't here anymore, and the people responsible for her death were still living their comfortable lives while David counted every penny just to buy gas. As he walked, David noticed something strange happening near an old warehouse at the end of the block. Men in expensive clothes were talking in hushed voices near several cars with tinted windows. These weren't the kind of men you'd expect to see in a neighborhood like this. Their shoes were too clean, their watches too shiny, their manner too confident. David's military training from years ago kicked in automatically. Something about the scene didn't feel right. The men kept looking around nervously, checking their phones and speaking in languages he didn't recognize. One of them was counting money, thick stacks of bills that he kept tucked inside his jacket. Curiosity got the better of him. David had come here with his own dark purpose, but something about what he was seeing made him forget about his plans for a moment. He moved closer, staying in the shadows between buildings, watching. That's when he heard it. A sound that cut through his anger and grief like a knife through butter. It was the sound of someone crying. Not just crying, but the kind of desperate sobbing that comes from fear and pain mixed together. And it was coming from inside the warehouse. David's first instinct was to walk away. He had his own problems, his own mission. Getting involved in someone else's trouble was the last thing he needed. But the crying continued. And something about it reminded him of sounds he'd heard before. Sounds from hospital rooms when families received bad news. Sounds from his own throat during those long nights after the funeral. He moved closer to the warehouse, staying low and quiet. Through a crack in the boarded-up windows, he could see inside. What he saw made his blood run cold and his plans for revenge suddenly seemed small and selfish. The warehouse wasn't abandoned like it appeared from the outside. It had been converted into something that looked like a prison. There were mattresses, on the floor, chains attached to the walls, and the smell of fear and desperation hung in the air like smoke. But it was what he saw in the back corner that changed everything. A young woman, probably no older than his own daughter would have been if he'd had kids, was lying on a dirty mattress. She was clearly in distress, holding her swollen belly and crying out in pain. Even from his hiding spot, David could tell she was about to give birth. The men outside were still talking, but now David could make out some of their conversation. They were discussing money, discussing buyers, discussing timelines. They talked about the girl inside like she was a piece of property, not a human being. David's hands began to shake, but not from fear. From rage. The same rage that had brought him to this town, but now directed at something even more evil than the people who had failed his wife. These men were trading in human lives, treating a young woman like an animal to be sold. For a moment, David stood frozen between two worlds. The world where he came here to buy a weapon and settle his own scores, and a world where he could try to help someone who needed it more than he needed revenge. The girl's cries grew louder, more desperate. She was calling out words in Spanish that David didn't understand, but the fear in her voice was universal. She was alone, scared, and about to bring a child into the worst possible circumstances. David closed his eyes and heard his wife's voice in his memory. There's always a choice, David. Even when it doesn't feel like it, there's always a choice to do the right thing. When he opened his eyes, his mission had changed completely. The gun he came to buy suddenly seemed less important than the life he might be able to save. And for the first time in 3 months, David felt something other than anger and grief. He felt purpose. David's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The voices outside the warehouse were getting louder, and he knew he had to make a decision fast. The girl inside was crying out again, and this time her voice sounded weaker, more desperate. He looked around the back of the building and found what he was looking for, a small window, barely big enough for a person to crawl through, with glass so dirty you could barely see through it. But it was unlocked, probably broken for months. David took a deep breath and squeezed through the window, trying not to make any noise. His shirt caught on a piece of broken glass, tearing it, but he didn't care. Once inside, the smell hit him like a wall. It was the smell of fear, of people who hadn't been allowed to wash properly, of a place where terrible things happened. The warehouse was bigger inside than it looked from outside. There were maybe 20 mattresses scattered around the floor, some with chains nearby. Empty food containers were piled in corners. A single bare light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting strange shadows everywhere. But David's attention went straight to the back corner where he'd seen the girl from outside. She was lying on her side, holding her belly, and when she heard his footsteps, she looked up with eyes wide with terror. "Please," she whispered in accented English. "Please, don't hurt me." David stopped in his tracks. The girl couldn't have been more than 17 years old. She had dark hair that was soaked with sweat, and her face was pale with exhaustion. Her clothes were torn and dirty, like she'd been wearing them for weeks. "I'm not going to hurt you," David said softly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "My name is David. What's your name?" The girl stared at him for a long moment, trying to decide if she could trust him. "Isabella," she finally whispered. "My name is Isabella." "Okay, Isabella. I can see you're in pain. How long have you been like this?" Isabella tried to sit up but couldn't manage it. "Since this morning," she said, breathing heavily. The baby is coming." David felt his stomach drop. He'd never delivered a baby in his life. Sure, he'd had basic medical training in the military, but that was years ago, and it was mostly about treating wounds, not bringing new life into the world. "Where are the men who brought you here?" he asked, looking toward the front of the warehouse. "They went to meet the people who want to buy my baby," Isabella said, and started crying again. "They said they'll be back soon. They said after the baby comes, they'll take it away, and then they'll sell me to someone else." David felt that familiar rage building up inside him again, but this time it wasn't the helpless anger he'd been carrying around for months. This was focused, clear anger at people who deserved it. "How did you end up here, Isabella?" Through her tears and pain, Isabella told him her story. She was from a small village in Guatemala. Her family was poor, and when men came to their village promising good jobs in America, her parents thought it was an answer to their prayers. They paid the men their life savings to bring Isabella north, thinking she'd be able to send money home. But the men lied about everything. Instead of a job, Isabella found herself trapped, passed from one group of criminals to another. She'd been sold 3 times already, each time to people who treated her worse than an animal. When she got pregnant, the current group decided her baby would be worth more money than she was. "They already have buyers lined up," she said between contractions. "Rich people who can't have kids of their own. They're going to pay $50,000 for a healthy baby." David's mind was racing. He could hear voices outside getting closer. The men were probably coming back to check on Isabella and prepare for the birth. He had maybe minutes to figure out what to do. "Isabella, listen to me," he said, kneeling down beside her mattress. "I'm going to get you out of here, okay? But first, we need to take care of you and your baby." "You can't," Isabella said, shaking her head. "They have guns. They'll kill both of us if they find you here." "Let me worry about that," David said. He looked around the warehouse and spotted a stack of clean towels near one of the walls, probably left there for exactly this situation. "Right now, I need you to focus on breathing, okay? Just like they teach in those baby classes." Isabella looked at him with surprise. "You know about having babies?" David smiled sadly. "My wife and we tried for years to have kids. We went to all the classes, read all the books. It just never happened for us." The pain of that old wound mixed with everything else David was feeling. He and his wife had wanted children so badly. They'd planned names, painted a nursery, dreamed about little league games and school plays. But it wasn't meant to be, and eventually they'd accepted that they'd just be happy with each other. Now here he was, about to help bring a baby into the world under the worst possible circumstances. Another contraction hit Isabella stronger than the others. She grabbed David's hand and squeezed it so hard he thought she might break his fingers, but he didn't pull away. "It's okay," he said. "You're doing great. Just breathe through it." When the contraction passed, Isabella looked at him with exhausted eyes. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." David thought about that question. A few hours ago, he would have said he didn't care about anyone else's problems. He was too wrapped up in his own pain and anger. But looking at this scared young woman, seeing her courage in the face of something so terrifying, he realized something had changed inside him. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "And because someone once told me that even when everything seems hopeless, there's always a choice to do something good." Isabella squeezed his hand again, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. David heard footsteps outside the warehouse getting closer. Men's voices speaking in Spanish, talking about money and schedules. His time was running out. "Isabella, we're going to get through this," he said, looking directly into her eyes. "You and your baby are going to be okay, I promise you that." As the footsteps got closer to the door, David realized that everything in his life had led him to this moment. All the pain, all the anger, all the grief had brought him here, to this place, to help this young woman and her unborn child. He'd come to this town looking for a way to hurt the people who had hurt him. Instead, he'd found someone who needed him to be better than his worst impulses. The door to the warehouse started to open. The warehouse door creaked open slowly, and David's mind went into overdrive. He had maybe 30 seconds before the men walked in and found him with Isabella. His military training kicked in, and he quickly scanned the room for options. "Isabella," he whispered urgently, "I need you to stay as quiet as possible, okay? No matter what happens." She nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying out as another contraction hit her. David could see the fear in her eyes, but also a new kind of hope that hadn't been there before. David moved quickly to the side of the room, positioning himself behind a stack of old crates where he could see the door but stay hidden. He heard footsteps and voices getting closer. "The buyers will be here in 2 hours," a man's voice said in English with a thick accent. "We need to make sure everything is ready." "What if there are complications?" another voice asked. "What if something goes wrong with the birth?" "Then, we deal with it," the first voice replied coldly. "The baby is worth 50,000. The girl, well, she's replaceable." David felt his hands clench into fists. These men were talking about Isabella and her unborn child like they were nothing more than products to be sold. He'd heard people talk about others without caring before, but never quite like this. The door opened wider, and 3 men walked, and David could see them clearly now. They were dressed better than most people in this town with expensive watches and phones. But their eyes were cold, empty of the kind of warmth that made people human. "How is she doing?" one of them asked, walking toward Isabella's corner. Isabella didn't answer. She was trying to control her breathing, but David could see she was in serious pain. The baby was coming whether anyone was ready or not. "I asked you a question," the man said more harshly. "The pain is getting worse," Isabella managed to say. I think the baby is coming soon." The 3 men looked at each other and nodded. One of them pulled out his phone and made a call. "Yeah, it's happening now," he said into the phone. "Bring the medical supplies and get here fast. And make sure the buyers know they need to be ready with the money." David realized this was his moment. He could stay hidden and let whatever was going to happen happen. Or he could do something about it. Every part of his brain that had kept him alive in dangerous situations was telling him to stay put, to not get involved, to think about his own safety first. But then Isabella cried out in pain, and David heard something else in her voice. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was the sound of someone fighting, someone who hadn't given up even when everything seemed hopeless. That sound reminded him of his wife during those last weeks in the hospital. Even when the doctor said there was nothing more they could do, she kept fighting. She kept believing that tomorrow might be better than today. David made his choice. He stood up from behind the crates and walked into the open. The 3 men spun around, surprised and immediately on guard. "Who the hell are you?" the first man demanded, reaching inside his jacket. "Someone who's going to help that girl," David said calmly. He kept his hands visible but ready to move if he needed to. The second man laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "You picked the wrong place to play. Hero, old man. You need to walk away right now if you want to keep breathing." David looked past them at Isabella, who was staring at him with wide eyes. She was scared, but she wasn't telling him to leave. She was trusting him to know what he was doing. "Here's the thing," David said, taking a step closer to the men. "I came to this town tonight with some pretty dark thoughts in my head. I was planning to do something I probably would have regretted for the rest of my life, but then I found this girl and I realized something." "What's that?" the third man asked, also reaching for whatever weapon he had hidden. "I realized that sometimes life gives you a chance to do something that actually matters. Something that makes the world a little bit better instead of worse." The first man pulled out his gun and pointed it at David. "Last warning. Walk away." David didn't move. "That girl is about to have a baby, a real human being who deserves a chance at a good life, and you're planning to sell that baby like it's a car or a piece of furniture." "It's business," the second man said. "Nothing personal." "It's personal to me," David replied, "because I spent 3 months being angry at the world for taking away someone I loved. But that anger was eating me alive. It was turning me into someone I didn't recognize." Isabella cried out again, louder this time. "The baby was definitely coming in soon. She needs help," David said. "Real help, not whatever you had planned." The man with the gun took a step closer. "You're not thinking clearly, friend. There are 3 of us and 1 of you. We have weapons. You have nothing." David smiled, and for the first time in months it felt genuine. "Actually, I have something you don't." "What's that?" "Nothing left to lose," David said. 3 months ago, I lost the only thing that mattered to me. I've been walking around like a dead man ever since. But looking at that brave young woman over there, seeing her fight for her baby's life, I remembered something important. The men looked confused, not sure what David was getting at. I remembered that sometimes the most important thing you can do is help someone else even if it costs you everything. My wife used to say that kindness was the only thing that really lasted. I didn't believe her then, but I think I'm starting to understand what she meant. Isabella's contractions were getting stronger and closer together. David could see that the baby would be born very soon, with or without medical help. "Let me help her," David said to the men. "Let me help bring this baby into the world safely. Then we can figure out what happens next." The first man kept his gun pointed at David, but David could see uncertainty in his eyes. Maybe these men weren't completely heartless. Maybe there was still something human left in them. "Please," Isabella called out weakly. "The baby is coming now." David looked at the three men, then at Isabella, then back at the men. "I'm going to help her whether you like it or not. You can shoot me if you want, but that's not going to stop what's happening over there." Without waiting for an answer, David walked over to Isabella and knelt down beside her mattress. The men followed him with their eyes and weapons, but they didn't stop him. "It's okay," David whispered to Isabella. "I'm here now. We're going to get through this together." As David helped Isabella prepare for the birth of her child, he realized that everything in his life had changed in the space of a few minutes. He'd come here looking for revenge, but instead, he'd found something much more powerful. He'd found a reason to live again. The next few minutes felt like hours to David. Isabella was gripping his hand so tight he lost feeling in his fingers, but he didn't dare move away from her. The three men stood around them in a circle, their weapons still drawn, watching everything with cold calculation. "This is taking too long," the first man said, checking his watch. "The buyers will be here soon, and they're expecting everything to be ready." David ignored him, focusing entirely on Isabella. "You're doing amazing," he whispered to her. "Just keep breathing like I showed you." Isabella's face was covered in sweat and she looked exhausted, but there was something different in her eyes now. Instead of just fear, David could see determination. She was fighting not just for herself anymore, but for her baby. "I can see the head," David said quietly, his voice filled with wonder. Despite everything horrible about the situation, he was about to witness the miracle of new life coming into the world. The second man stepped closer. "Hurry this up. We don't have all night." "Babies come when they're ready," David said firmly. "You can't rush this." Isabella cried out again, and David could tell she was getting close. All those classes he'd taken with his wife years ago were coming back to him. The breathing techniques, the encouraging words, the way to help someone through the most intense experience of their life. "One more big push, Isabella," David said. "Your baby wants to meet you." With a final effort that seemed to take everything she had left, Isabella pushed, and suddenly David was holding a tiny, perfect baby girl. The baby's first cry filled the warehouse, echoing off the concrete walls like a song of hope. "She's beautiful," David whispered, tears running down his face. He quickly cleaned the baby with one of the towels and wrapped her carefully. "Isabella, you have a daughter." Isabella was crying too, but these were tears of joy mixed with exhaustion. When David placed the baby in her arms, something magical happened. The fear in Isabella's eyes was replaced by pure love. Nothing else in the world mattered except this tiny person she was holding. "Hello, little one," Isabella whispered to her daughter. "I'm your mama." The three men stood watching this moment, and for just a second, David thought he saw something human in their faces, but it didn't last long. "All right, that's enough," the first man said. "Hand over the baby. Our buyers are paying good money, and they're expecting a healthy child." David felt his protective instincts kick in stronger than ever. "No." "What did you say?" "I said no." David stood up slowly, positioning himself between the men and Isabella. "You're not taking this baby anywhere." The second man laughed harshly. "Old man, you're really starting to annoy me. That baby represents $50,000. You think we're just going to walk away from that kind of money?" "That baby," David said, his voice steady and calm, is not money. She's a human being. She has a mother who loves her, and I'm not going to let you destroy 2 lives just so you can make a profit. The third man, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. You're outnumbered and outgunned. What exactly do you think you're going to do? David looked at each of them carefully. These men were criminals, but they were also businessmen. They made their money by staying under the radar, by not drawing attention to themselves. They didn't want trouble any more than he did. Here's what I think, David said. I think you're smart enough to know that this situation has gotten complicated. You came here expecting a simple transaction, but now you have a witness who isn't going to stay quiet about what he's seen. The first man's grip tightened on his gun. That's easily solved. Is it? David asked. Because I already called someone before I came in here. This was a lie, but David said it with such confidence that the men looked uncertain. You're bluffing, the second man said, but David could hear doubt in his voice. Am I? David pulled out his phone and showed them the screen. See this? I sent a text message to my friend who works for the Border Patrol. I told him exactly where I am and what I found. If I don't call him back in the next 10 minutes, he's bringing a whole team down here. Another lie, but the men didn't know that. David could see them looking at each other, trying to decide if he was telling the truth. You're lying, the third man said, but he didn't sound sure. Maybe I am, David said. But are you willing to bet your freedom on it? Because if I'm telling the truth and the authorities show up here, you're all going to prison for a very long time. Human trafficking carries a life sentence in this state. The men were definitely worried now. They kept looking at their phones, at the door, at each other. Isabella, still holding her baby, watched everything with wide eyes. She didn't understand all the words being said, but she could tell that David was fighting for her and her daughter. Even if you are telling the truth, the first man said, you're still not walking out of here. Actually, I am, David said, and I'm taking Isabella and her baby with me. Like hell you are. David took a deep breath. This was the biggest risk he'd ever taken in his life, but he knew it was the right thing to do. Let me tell you something about rock bottom, David said to the 3 men. 3 months ago, I hit it hard. I lost my wife, my house, my savings, everything that mattered to me. I came to this town tonight planning to buy a gun and do something stupid with it. The men listened, confused about where this was going. But then I found Isabella, and I realized something important. When you've lost everything, when you have nothing left to lose, you become dangerous in a different way. Not because you want to hurt people, but because you're willing to do anything to protect what's right. David started walking toward the door, motioning for Isabella to follow him. She struggled to her feet, still holding her baby, weak from giving birth but determined to trust this man who had helped her. You're not going anywhere, the first man said, pointing his gun directly at David. Yes, we are, David replied calmly. Because you're businessmen, not killers, and killing 3 people in a warehouse is going to bring the kind of attention that's bad for business. The men looked uncertain. They were used to dealing with people who were afraid of them, not someone who seemed completely unafraid of dying. David helped Isabella walk toward the door. Each step felt like it took forever, but the men didn't stop them. This isn't over, the second man called out. David turned back to look at them one last time. Yes, it is, because I'm taking Isabella and her baby somewhere safe, and then I'm making sure everyone knows what happened here tonight. This warehouse, your operation, all of it ends now. As David and Isabella walked out into the night air, Isabella holding her newborn daughter close, David felt something he hadn't felt in months. He felt alive again. 3 months had passed since that night in the warehouse, and David barely recognized the man he used to be. He stood in the small office space he'd rented downtown, looking at the sign painter putting the finishing touches on the window. Second Chance's Recovery Center, it read in bold, hopeful letters. Isabella walked in carrying little Sophia, who had grown into the most beautiful baby David had ever seen. Isabella looked completely different too. Her hair was clean and styled. She wore clothes that actually fit her, and most importantly, the fear was gone from her eyes. In its place was something David never thought he'd see again in anyone, Pure happiness. The reporter from Channel 7 will be here in an hour, Isabella said in English that had improved dramatically over the past few months. Are you ready for this? David laughed and shook his head. I don't think anyone's ever ready to be on television, but if it helps other people, then I guess we have to do it. The past 3 months had been the busiest and most meaningful of David's entire life. After getting Isabella and Sophia to the hospital that night, he'd kept his promise about exposing the trafficking operation. The warehouse was raided 2 days later, and 12 other victims were rescued. The 3 men he'd confronted were now serving prison sentences that would keep them locked up for decades. But David didn't stop there. Using the money from selling his house, he'd started the recovery center to help trafficking victims rebuild their lives. Isabella had become his partner in the project, using her own experience to help other survivors heal from their trauma. Mr. David, came a small voice from the doorway. A teenage girl named Carmen peeked in. She was one of the first people they'd helped at the center. The new family is here for their appointment. David smiled. Carmen had been so scared when she first arrived that she wouldn't even make eye contact with anyone. Now she was confident enough to help with the intake process for new clients. Send them in, David said. And Carmen, remember what we talked about. You don't have to call me Mr. David. Just David is fine. Carmen grinned and disappeared back down the hallway. David heard her talking to someone in Spanish, probably explaining that it was okay to come in, that this was a safe place. A moment later, a woman in her 30s entered with 2 small children. She looked the same way Isabella had looked that first night, scared, exhausted, and not sure if she could trust anyone. My name is Rosa, the woman said quietly. Someone told me you might be able to help us. Isabella stepped forward and began speaking to Rosa in Spanish, her voice gentle and reassuring. David watched as Rosa's shoulders relaxed slightly. There was something powerful about hearing from someone who had been through the same nightmare and come out the other side. While Isabella talked with Rosa, David picked up Sophia and walked over to the window. The baby gurgled happily and grabbed at his nose, something that never failed to make him smile. You know what, little one? He whispered to Sophia. Your mama saved my life just as much as I saved hers. It was true. In helping Isabella and Sophia, David had found a purpose he never knew he was looking for. The anger and grief that had been eating him alive were still there, but they'd transformed into something useful. Instead of wanting to hurt the people who had failed his wife, he now spent his energy helping people who needed someone to fight for them. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Detective Martinez, who had become a good friend over the past few months. David, I've got some news for you, the detective said. We just arrested 5 more people connected to that trafficking ring. The information you and Isabella provided has helped us shut down 3 more operations. That's incredible, David said. How many people were rescued? 26 this time, including 8 children. David felt that familiar tightness in his chest, but it was a good kind of tightness. 26 people who would get a second chance at life. 26 families who wouldn't have to wonder what happened to their loved ones. There's something else, Detective Martinez continued. The FBI wants to talk to you about expanding your program. They think what you're doing here could work in other cities too. After hanging up, David found Isabella in the main room, still talking with Rosa. The 2 women were holding hands now, and Rosa was crying, but these looked like tears, of relief rather than fear. Isabella, David said quietly, can I talk to you for a minute? They stepped into the hallway and David told her about the detective's call. 26 more people rescued, Isabella repeated, her eyes filling with tears. Because of what we're doing here, because of what you started, David corrected her. If I hadn't found you that night. But you did find me, Isabella interrupted. And you chose to help instead of walking away. That choice changed everything. David thought about the man he'd been 3 months ago. Angry, bitter, planning to buy a gun and do something terrible with it. That man seemed like a stranger now. You know what the strangest part is? David said. I came to that town looking for a way to hurt people who had hurt me. I thought that would make me feel better about losing my wife. Isabella nodded, understanding what he was trying to say. But helping you and Sophia, starting this place, seeing people like Rosa get their lives back, this makes me feel closer to my wife than anything else I could have done. She always said the best way to honor someone you love is to love other people the way they would have. The reporter arrived right on time, a friendly woman named Jennifer who had been covering their story since the warehouse raid. She set up her camera in the main room where several of the program's success stories had gathered. Carmen was there, now enrolled in high school and planning to become a social worker. There was Miguel, a young man who had been forced to work in construction without pay for 2 years before being rescued. And Rosa was there too, having decided just an hour earlier that she wanted to share her story to help other people. So, David, Jennifer said once the cameras were rolling, when you walked into that warehouse 3 months ago, did you ever imagine it would lead to all this? David looked around the room at all the faces, people who had been given second chances, people who were building new lives, people who had hope again. Not in a million years, he said honestly. I went to that town as probably the angriest, most broken person you could imagine. But sometimes life puts you exactly where you need to be even when you don't realize it. What would you say to other people who might be in dark places right now? Jennifer asked. David thought carefully about his answer. I'd say that our worst moments don't have to define us. Sometimes when everything falls apart, it's actually making room for something better to grow. And sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is to help someone else. After the interview, David stood outside the center as the sun was setting. Isabella joined him, still carrying Sophia. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For showing me that there are still good people in the world. For proving that one person really can make a difference. David smiled and put his arm around Isabella's shoulders in a brotherly way. Thank you for reminding me what it means to be alive. As they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, David thought about his wife and how proud she would be of the man he'd become. The pain of losing her would never completely go away, but it had become something beautiful, a reminder to cherish every day and to never waste an opportunity to help someone who needed it. Sophia babbled happily in her mother's arms, reaching toward the colorful sky. She was growing up in a world where people cared about her, where her mother was safe and loved, where anything was possible. David had come to that warehouse looking for an ending. Instead, he'd found a beginning.